Right. Change all my settings here back from doing school visits to doing public events here. I'm switching back and forth. I think everybody is joining here. So good evening, everyone. My name is Ginny, and I am with Anderson's Bookshops, and I am very pleased to welcome you to this virtual author event with Samantha Silva in conversation with Natalie Jenner. Hi to you both, and thank you for being with us. And thank you to all of you joining us from, I hope, all over. I know we've got some international representation from our author in Canada, at least. So we're glad to have you join us from wherever you currently are. And we do just like to take a moment as Anderson's Bookshops to say thank you and tell you how grateful we are for joining us and for your support. We are an independent bookstore for any of you who are not familiar with us yet. Anderson's has been owned and run by the Anderson family for going on 6 generations. And we are still a family-owned business, and we love to connect authors and readers right now, obviously only in a virtual way, not in person, though we wish it could be. And we hope that's happening soon, but we are really glad to be able to connect to you from wherever you are. So thank you for your support. It does mean a lot to us, and we thank you for that. In before times, we would be doing over 400 in-person events a year. And so obviously we're trying to meet as many of those as we can virtually, but some other things coming up that you might be interested in. I think tomorrow is Mary Alice Monroe. In conversation with Debbie Maycomer. We have Mary Dixie Carter next week with a brand new thriller. Elizabeth Hinton as well with her fantastic new nonfiction book called America on Fire. So lots of great things coming up. Please do check out our website, andersonsbookshop.com, or any of our social media handles to find your next author event to join us with. But today we're so happy. We are the first event to help launch this great new book, Love and Fury by Samantha Silva, who just came out yesterday. So I'd like to officially introduce them. Samantha is the author of the novels Love and Fury and Mr. Dickens and His Carol, and a screenwriter who has sold projects to Paramount, Universal, and New Line Cinema. And she's joining us from Boise, Ohio. Ohio. Listen to me. I'm combining Ohio and Idaho for some reason. Boise, Idaho. And Natalie Jenner, who's gracious enough to join us as our moderator tonight, was born in England, raised in Canada, and graduated from the University of Toronto with consecutive degrees in English literature and law. Way to go. She worked for decades in the legal industry and also founded the independent bookstore Archetype Books in Oakville, Ontario, where she lives with her family and 2 rescue dogs. Yay for rescue dogs. She is a lifelong devotee of all things Jane Austen, and her new novel, The Jane Austen Society, which will be her first published novel, is out next month, if I'm correct, in June, right?
Actually, it came out a year ago today in hardcover.
Oh gosh, yes, in hard. That's the paperback.
It releases in paperback. Yeah, no, but this is sort of a nice. So I actually have my champagne at the ready from dinner.
As you should.
Celebrating my 1-year book anniversary, they call it, I guess. So.
Yes, your book anniversary. Yes, we definitely want to celebrate that. Well, welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations on all of the things. And I can't wait to talk more about the book with you.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, we're so glad. So what do we want to start off with here? I think, Natalie, did you have kind of a direction you wanted to head?
Oh, you mean in terms of starting to just pummel her with questions?
Absolutely.
Prepared to be pummeled.
Are you prepared to be pummeled? I think that my first question actually was not why Mary Wollstonecraft for this book, but when was the moment where you first thought about writing about her? That was something I really wanted to know.
It was actually around the time when Mr. Dickens and His Carol had sort of, done its turn in the world, and I was really casting around for the next thing to focus on. And it happened to be the 200th anniversary of Frankenstein, and Mary Shelley was everywhere and in the zeitgeist, and Frankenstein was in the zeitgeist. And I was honestly having a conversation with my wonderful agent, Emma Perry, who's English and just lovely. And she sort of said, yeah, no one really knows, everyone knows Mary Shelley, but no one really knows very much about Wollstonecraft. Yeah. And, we had a conversation about it, and especially about the sort of mother-daughter aspect of it, the Shelley Wollstonecraft relationship that in a way never was.
Yeah.
And that, that was sort of a gateway for me. And I had completely forgotten until Emma reminded me much later that at the time I had just lost my own mother to a long illness, although it was very sudden. And I was getting ready to sort of, launch my youngest daughter into the world. Yeah. And there was that sort of liminal space between daughterhood and motherhood that I didn't realize I wanted to explore. But it was, but it was very much sort of an entree. And so I mean, I didn't know very much about Mary Wollstonecraft. And I think certainly, most people, because Mary Shelley often, her nom de plume was Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. People, when they hear Wollstonecraft, they think of her and they think of Frankenstein. And so, in many ways, I had to educate myself about her. And I read, every biography and the collected letters, everything I could get my hands on. But it became clear pretty early on in the process that in some way it would be a story about the daughter and the mother who never knew each other.
I mean, I love this book so much. And I've told everyone, this is the best we're both historical fiction writers. This is the best historical fiction book I will read this year. I know that already for a fact. But one of the things I loved about it was it's an exploration of a woman from every possible angle: childhood friend, lover, leader, revolutionary, like everything you can think of. I thought that the way that you have the book structured, which reflects these very important, is it 10 days?
Yes.
These very important 10 days. And I was wondering how the decision of how to structure the book and that time that you chose, which is, I don't want to give away spoilers, but they aren't going to get to know each other for very long. And this book, in a way, is your imprinting of her story on her daughter for life. And the way you structure it really enhances that. What was the decision-making that went into how you decide to structure this book?
Well, there's always false starts, I think, with novels, unless it arrives to you, out of whole cloth. But I initially thought, again, because I was stuck on Mary Shelley too, that I wanted to do something where Mary Shelley, the daughter, discovers who the mother is, through a cache of letters, sort of like Stegner's Angle of Repose, which is a book I admire so much. And it's amazing how that story is created, the story of Susan Ward, his grandmother, through the discovery of her letters. And so I wrote a chapter that I still love, as a first chapter, which is Mary Shelley on the night she starts Frankenstein, receiving this cache of letters from her father, William Godwin, with whom she had a very difficult relationship. And so, sort of as she's writing, but anyway, never mind that, because it was wonderful and smarter than I am, said, no, just forget about Mary Shelley, because again, everyone knows her.
Yeah.
We want to be with Wollstonecraft. And so that, made me have to sort of rethink the entire idea for the novel. And when again, also because I come from screenwriting, I think I'm very, I'm very structure driven and very plot driven, and I sort of need to understand plot before I start writing. And so, I had butcher paper up across my living room wall, and Post-it notes, and I'm trying to figure out the plot points and plot twists in her life. But it also, I kept coming back to this notion of of those 11 days between her giving birth to a frail daughter who's going to die, and then realizing in the last 5 days that she's dying. And so I really wanted that seemed to suggest such a perfect structure.
Oh yeah.
Each of those days. And in a way, it also limited me to, okay, you can pick 11 stories, 11 plot points from her life. And those are the stories that she will narrate to her daughter.
Which would be hard, because one of the things I would tell everyone who hasn't read this book yet is that you will go into a Wikipedia rabbit hole. Like, you will want to look up Imlay and the Swiss artist and Joseph Johnson. Like, you'll want to look everybody up, and you'll be like, could this really have happened? And then when I was reading it, the most fantastical elements of the book were the ones that were definitely from real life. Because as a screenwriter, I'm sure that concept of life being stranger than fiction, that there were some choices that she made. And I was wondering, what about her as a character and as a real life figure what element of her life story were you most entranced by when you were writing? Do you remember a certain chapter or character relationship?
I think that each of the chapters took me such a long time to write, because I had to sort of immerse myself in that moment, that moment in history, that moment in her own life, where she lived, what that village was like, what her family life was then, who were the characters around her. And so I would literally just go and immerse myself in that, in that moment, and, talk about rabbit holes. There's just no end to it. And then, eventually the story of that story, that sort of encapsulated moment of her life would reveal itself and then in its own way have a beginning, middle, and end. And then, you're ready. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the French Revolution, to me, which is another, an entire book in itself.
Oh, absolutely.
Moving to Paris.
Yeah. It was crazy. I couldn't believe she did that. I was like, how dangerous. And she stays at the most dangerous time. And that's actually one of those time periods that I'm most fascinated by. And I just was riveted. The book is so lyrically written, so beautifully written, which I thought was such a great testament to the time period you were writing about, and also her qualities as a writer and the way I'm sure she approached language, because she was a very multifaceted author, and she could write a novel, she could write a political, polemic, treatise. And I was wondering, when you write, what is the favorite moment for you as a writer? For me, it's a bunch of people in a room going at it. So like a lot of dialogue, kind of like, I guess, a screenplay in a way. When you're writing, what types of passages for you are the most satisfying as an author?
I agree with that, actually. And again, because of a history of screenwriting, I really like scene writing.
Yeah.
And I like dialogue, and I do like getting people in a room and understanding the stakes of the situation.
Yeah.
And then having them talk around that.
Yeah.
Is really interesting. But because these were people who were, disparate, I could study, Fuseli here and Mary here and Joseph Johnson here and Erasmus Darwin, father of Charles Darwin. But to put them at a dinner table is a different thing. And so, in many ways, I draw very much from things they really said, whether it was in their letters or that they're not, or in their writings, and kind of find their voice in those things, and then get those characters to interact about real things at a real dinner table. And so that I love that. That probably comes the most. I don't know if any of it comes easily, but that's the most fun for me.
I think that's what I'm setting up when I'm writing as well. Like when I'm writing, I think I'm actually setting everything up just so I can have those group scenes. And I have a friend who's a thriller writer, and someone asked if she ever gets writer's block. And she says, well, I always write to the middle. And I realized, Sam, that in the middle of my books, because I'm a very prolific unpublished author, one published, but in the middle, there's always a dynamic group scene. And for me, when I was reading your book, it's rare that I want to be in the pages of the book. Like, oh, I wish that I was that person at the time. But the Joseph Johnson dinners in London with all the, radical thinkers and artists, for me, were some of the most incredibly engaging and sort of vital scenes that I've read recently. And it was because you had, like you said, this amazing cast of characters pulled together.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I sort of grew up with the idea of the dinner table being the source of everything, of all knowledge, of all great storytelling, of morality, of humanism, of faith, of spirit, of everything, in my life personally has happened around the dinner table for the most part. And so
it's true.
And it's what a play is so often, and I really believe in that, and so it's challenging, and even the scenes where you get a couple people alone at the same dinner table, Mary Wollstonecraft being seduced or seducing Henry Fuseli, the Swiss artist.
Yeah.
What is that? We don't really have any clues about what that was like, and all of their letters to each other disappeared, were burned. We don't really know what happened to them, but you still sort of, because you've created the feel of the dinner table, it helps you find what that seduction was and what those moments between them, very late at night, after the plates have been taken away and brought back, and the wine glasses emptied, what those conversations might have been.
It's really interesting because I'm doing my research on you in order to ask you questions. And you had mentioned, I think in your family background, the value of storytelling or keeping people's attention at the dinner table, which was very much in my family as well. And a family of five very verbal, argumentative people. With my father, as you got his attention if you told a really great story of something that happened to you at school that day. And I do think that's a bit of the birth for me, and it sounds like it is for you as well, of the storyteller. Do you want to be a writer from the time you were like really little?
Well, actually, I think that I'm a better listener than I am a storyteller in the moment. You know, I really can absorb story. And but it takes me a while. I'm that sort of, my dad calls it a staircase orator, where I think of the perfect thing to say at the end of the party, going upstairs after the party's over. And so I sort of write in order to understand what I think and what I believe. And I'm slow. I'm a slow writer, and it takes me a long time. But my kids will remember that when they were growing up, and again, we had very much a sense of the dinner table, and it was voluble and fascinating, and with a ever-changing cast of characters. But if someone told a story, we created a game where if someone told a great story, you got to call like dibs on that, dibs on the novel, dibs on the short story, but you had to name the genre.
I love that.
That's a great story, but it's a play. It's a great short story.
Or it's a Super Bowl commercial. Great story. No, it's hilarious. I love that.
That's how I absorb. And so I think from very early on, I'm one of 5 kids, and there was a lot of talk, and I was shy. Actually, I was introverted and still am to some extent, but I'm a great absorber. And I think that, that led me to want to write, and, starting with poetry in 3rd grade and playwriting in 5th, and on, starting novels in 6th, and then being distracted for a few decades and coming back to it.
Oh yeah, absolutely, me too. Real life and work and responsibilities and family and all that stuff. So I think, yeah, we both have sort of started the novel writing career a little later than average. You had said just now about writing to find out what you know. And I remember there's this great line that I quote from Joan Didion, where she says, "I write because I am not self-aware." And I'm always like, oh yeah, that's why I do it. I do it because I don't understand what's going on, and that's how I work it out. And that's what for me is so fun. You've talked in some of your interviews about being very much enjoying editing and the process and outlining and having character arcs. And that I think you said once that you would put your head in the oven if you had to actually just write without knowing what's going to happen. I'm a total pantser, so I'm the total opposite of you. And I also write sequentially, which I understand you don't always do either. And I hate editing. And I'm wondering if this is like, where is the middle of the Venn diagram for us with our writing process? But what is for you is the most favorite part of the writing process of the manuscript?
Oh God, that's a good question. I like different parts of it. I like the idea formation. I like finding the story and figuring it out, and and plotting and outlining and drawing arcs and thinking about it really thematically. I mean, I really like the idea that, for instance, in a screenplay, when I talk about screenwriting, I say that the DNA of the whole has to live really in every scene, so that someone would be able to see one scene or read one scene of the movie, and they would get a sense of what it was about. It's easy to say and very hard to do, and certainly much harder in a novel because you have much expanses of time and place and an event in a way that isn't focused like a screenplay. But I think a lot about theme, and I write. It's when I journal write the most. I really sort of like to get up in the morning with a cup of coffee where I'm still close to the dreamland, and try to understand why am I writing this? Why do I want to do this? And will this, what am I working out? And how, will it generate enough energy in me to sustain it? Because you have to sustain, I mean, not just your own interest and energy, but you have to sustain plot and character and interest. And so I really love idea formation. And then probably on the other side, editing for me is like fine tuning and sculpting. And I always think, when they give me deadlines, like, if you gave me 1 more month or 6 more months, it would be so much better. Why Stop now. Do I really have to stop? But thank God for deadlines, because otherwise I'd still be fiddling on Mr. Dickens and Miss Carroll.
I'm looking at the back of your credenza, or shelf, and I see these little, are they action figurines?
Yes,
Is Jane Austen one of them, Sam?
Of course, you have to have Jane Austen. Yes. Oscar Wilde, Shakespeare, and of course Dickens.
Yes, that's perfect. Yeah, no, we have the Jane Austen one. She has, her arm is broken. It's stuck together with a bandage, and she used to run a sanatorium ward in a dollhouse when my daughter was very young. Mentioning which, you named your son after a literary character.
I did.
I named my daughter after a literary character. So your son's name is?
Atticus.
Yeah, which is one of my top 3 books, To Kill a Mockingbird.
I
And
know.
my daughter's name is Phoebe, and her middle name is Josephine. So she's named after Holden Caulfield's kid sister in The Catcher in the Rye.
Okay, my daughter
And
named Phoebe.
is she named after Phoebe Caulfield from The Catcher in the Rye?
Say so, but no, not necessarily. That is so wild. That's
hilarious. Yeah. And then the worst of it is that, so I gave her the middle name Josephine after Joe in Little Women. And then when my daughter was old enough to read To Catch in the Rye, and I'm like, oh, your namesake's in there. And she's reading it. She's like, do you know that Holden Caulfield's kid sister's middle name is Josephine too? And then I was like, okay, I am so warped by my industry. I am like doing things I have no idea that it's all connected to books.
Yeah, that's funny. In fact, my son Atticus, his middle name is Harper, which is actually family name on his father's side. But I had as a digression, I had the sort of amazing experience when I was quite pregnant with him, probably six months pregnant. And I was in Sun Valley, Idaho, and just happened to stumble into a sort of Hollywood Christmas party. And Gregory Peck walked through the door.
Yeah.
And I'm not starstruck easily, but my heart was just going pitter-patter. And so I sat near him at dinner, across from him at the table, and he said, "What are you going to name your child?" And I said, "Well, if it's a boy, we're thinking about Atticus." And he grabbed my forearm and said, "That would be a very good name."
Oh my gosh.
So it was, there's no papal blessing better than that. So.
I don't have a story that cool. That's very cool. One of the things I love about Mary Wollstonecraft, and one of the things I think you captured about her in this book, is her capacity to love and her capacity to be vulnerable to others, and to embrace motherhood and intimacy and relationships. When I look back on all my favorite women authors, very few of them were mothers. George Eliot, Virginia Woolf, Edith Wharton, Catherine Ann Porter, like the Brontes and Jane Austen. For you, how many children? You have children, and you're writing about Mary Wollstonecraft, who had 2 children at a time. She was also highly prolific. I was in awe as I read your book of the amount of writing she was doing and living she was doing. Was that part of the enthrall for you?
Yes, I think so. Gosh, there's so much in that question and observation about her. First, in terms of Mary Wollstonecraft and love, when the book came, the actual physical book came, my best friend was here, whom I've known since I was 14 years old, and she held up the book and said, "Love and Fury, that pretty much says everything about you." And I thought at all that I was connecting to Wollstonecraft in those ways. But she, unlike my own experience, she came from such an abusive household.
Yeah.
An abusive, drunken father and a cold, unloving mother who herself wasn't getting the love she needed. And so it's remarkable to me always when people come out of that experience wanting love, like wanting to reinvent what that experience is and what family means and what love can mean, because they never got it as a child where they really deserved it and needed it. And she does, which is, just, I think, a remarkable testament to who she was as a human being. She was furious. She was, in a rage so often against injustice, but as a human being, she wanted connection and she wanted love and she sought it out, and she did make herself vulnerable, and she took a lot of hits because of it, but she kept coming back from and really and believed it. And when she became a mother, the first time when she gave birth to Fanny Imlay, she thought it was the most natural thing in the world, and the love that she as a mother felt for her daughter.
Yeah.
I think it made her again realize how bereft she was not to have had that from her own mother, and how different she would be and her life would have been. But she just, every time she takes a hit, she just gets up and dusts herself off and, and goes and sort of, is revivified and reinvigorated and takes on the next challenge, the next bigger thing. So I think she's really complicated. And also it's so clear that she dealt with severe anxiety and depression. And then we had terrible names for it, and it was really limited idea of thinking about it, often, hysteria for women.
Yeah.
But she battled it. She battled it. She went down hard, and then she'd get up again and find a reason to move on. So that's certainly one of the reasons that I find her enthralling. She's complicated and complex and indomitable. Yeah. And I really admire that. And it's tragic to me, even still, that she dies at age 38, really at the height of her powers. Mm-hmm. And in a moment where I think in her own personal life, she, finally experienced some kind of peace. Even though I think with her husband, radical philosopher William Godwin, she was negotiating all the time. This is how we're going to have equality. Yeah. I'm a writer, you're a writer. We have a daughter, we share my daughter, and we're having another child. Here's how the child here is going to work. Here's where we each have a writing, a room of one's own. I mean, it's very Virginia Woolf kinds of concerns.
She's great because I think at one point, she says, is it a vindication of the rights of women? Like, if men would just behave, we could do this, right? And I remember thinking that Jane Austen, I think, kind of worked more from within the system. Like, she didn't go outward and attack, but I think within the context of her stories, she was always exploring, how do you get what you want, and what kind of man should you pick that will help facilitate you to be able to be true to yourself and have that space and be a spunky Elizabeth Bennet. And I find it very interesting that Mary Wollstonecraft and Jane Austen aren't contemporaries, because I believe there's like a 15-16 year age difference. Mary Wollstonecraft is coming out of a very interesting period of reason and rational discourse and enlightenment. But obviously she's so passionate. She has a lot of the romanticism heritage as well. And Jane Austen is out on her own a little bit, working alongside pure romantics in the early 19th century. People are like, she wasn't a romantic, and yet today the cultural bias is that she was. With Mary Wollstonecraft, what do you hope with your book and with your discussion and your writing about her in terms of her legacy and how people should think about her and what she stood for, and on a more political or social cultural level, what is it you wish people maybe knew more about her?
Well, let me first address the issue of Jane Austen and Wollstonecraft. And you and I talked a little bit about this, but I had actually thought Jane Austen sort of, the whole idea, the ideas of Sense and Sensibility sort of exist in Austen's period and is a debate. And it was news to me, honestly, that this is a debate that raged throughout the 18th century. So Wollstonecraft, feels herself very much torn between these things because she is a creature of the Enlightenment and argues for reason and rationality, but also believes in sensibility. And part of that, I think, just comes from her own very self-aware, finely tuned experience of painful emotions and also sublime emotions. She's moved by nature. I mean, she is a romantic, and in some senses very strongly. And so she argues in a way, and more so later in her life, I think, for sense with sensibility, that these are both things that need to be integrated in one human being and can be and should be, but not the sensibility we think of as, silly women running around with their hair, you know, in the wind because they've lost their minds over a man, even though this is her, you know, in her own life. But that just to fine tune that women and men should be fine tuned to their own sensibilities, sensitivities, and emotions, and that those in fact can inform reason. And so the complexity, to me, that makes her a very modern person, very modern woman, which is one of the things I would like people who read this to take away about her, because she does have this kind of self-awareness and is, you know, very much grounded in intellect, and she had a quite expansive intellect and was well-read and self-taught. And yet this deep exploration of her own interior life, which feels very modern to me. And I think is best expressed in her last book, Letters from a Short Residence in Sweden, which is kind of, you know, part travelogue, treatise, you know, letters to a lover, to a pretend lover. It's really a kind of, you know, very modern piece of writing. Socially, or in terms of where we are now, I'm just stunned that we're still having these same conversations she was having. And so one of the things that I hope readers will take away is that her voice matters now, because 262 years on from when she was born, we're still debating these issues. I mean, when you look at what happened in the pandemic with women leaving their jobs or losing their jobs or having to stay home and really take on the brunt, even if a partner was there, having to take on the brunt of education, of housework, of house management, of all that. You know, it's incredible that happened, because these were things Wollstonecraft was talking about then, and even, you know, fighting for her in her own life. So, and certainly living in a place like Idaho, where we have a completely backwards legislature who won't fund, you know, currently won't fund early childhood education because someone accidentally says out loud, well, women really ought to be in the home because they're the best teachers. And so it's, you know, I mean, Wollstonecraft would be turning in her grave over things like that. And I just think that this isn't over. Not only is it not over, we're still in it the same way she was in it. I mean, yes, it's a different moment in history and there are different constraints on women, but we still are losing to the patriarchy. Men are still making the rules. It is still a world, you know, ruled by men, and white men at that. And, you know, and this was everything she argued against.
I mean, she really was ahead of her time. She was a creature of her time, but she was ahead of her time. And she, when I was doing my sort of supplemental reading, learned that she turned down sugar because she didn't want to support the slave trade.
Yes.
Which, when you think of how much of a norm in daily life, you know, and what it would take to sort of step back and go, you know, I'm actually going to turn down something that everybody else is consuming daily. And she was a vegan, and they were like, or explored that. Like she did these remarkable things, and she was very ahead of her time. And one of the things your book captures, I thought so well, Sam, was I felt like she could be my friend today. And I loved her energy. And I truly believe she was this way. And that is the ultimate compliment, I think, to a historical fiction novelist. I just need you to know that when I was reading your book, I was like, well, if she wasn't this way, she certainly, I think I'd like her to be this way. She could have been this way. And I suspect she really was. Do you have a view on what she would think of your book? Have you ever asked yourself? Because somebody asked me that when my book came out. They said, what do you think Jane Austen would think of your book? And I'm like, oh my God, I've never thought that. I don't want to think that. Have you ever wondered, though, if she ever, you know, if she were ever able to know how you portrayed her, what she would think?
Well, I didn't. I mean, I certainly think, you know, tackling someone like Mary Wollstonecraft or Jane Austen, you know, for that matter, certainly feels like, oh, you know, these are giants, these are icons, and you know, and avatars, and it's a great privilege and a burden to go there at all. But midway through, in fact, I just wrote a piece for LitHub. I ended up being a friend of mine gave me a session with her astrologer in New York. And, we're talking and I'm sort of trying to figure out, I'm stuck in the middle of the book and I feel lost. And I tell him, he's like, well, what's it about? And so I tell him Mary Wollstonecraft. He's like, well, when's her birthday? And so we really spent most of the session on her chart. And I felt like, wait, there's astrology for dead people? But anyway, we ended up having a really interesting conversation that from his perspective was about, you have a lot of crossover, the two of you. And she is, and she wants to be heard. She wants her story to be told, and she has something to say, and she'll say it. So, you might as well be the one to say it. And weirdly, I mean, whatever you believe about astrology, it was a strange kind of permission to have from, the universe, that it's okay to be intimate with her and to claim a kind of intimacy with her, because I think we're writing our own stories as well. I mean, again, some of the things, I did not have an abusive childhood, but certainly some of the things that she experienced, I as a woman experienced, and I know women today experience.
Yeah.
And so it was, more than, I have to be true to what it was like to be a woman in the late 18th century. It was more like, I have to be true to what it's like to be a woman in any time, and what that feels like, and what those constraints are, and what you experienced that really formed you.
Something that I think we're both very lucky and privileged to experience as writers, as historical fiction writers, especially of these women, is an intimacy with the workings of their mind, whether it's a real understanding or not. I felt exceedingly close to Jane Austen when I sat down to write my book after doing a year of unintentional research. And I'm surmising that you felt the same way about Mary Wollstonecraft. And tell me, I know how it feels for me. Can you tell me how that felt, that connection to her being, her emotions, and her mind as a fellow woman? Because I know I found it very special. I suspect it was the same for you.
Well, and I went through something very similar and for a much longer time with Charles Dickens. So that is another story unto itself. But I think that one of the tricks is that when you're dealing with a real historical figure, and the best English biographers in the business have taken her on, Claire Tomlin, Janet Todd, Lyndall Gordon, Charlotte Gordon. You read the biographies and they read like page turners. And there's a part of you as a writer that thinks, well, why would I bother? And they've pretty much covered it. And she's so alive on their pages. What else do I have to contribute to it? But what I found was that, because they have to be devoted to the truth and committed to the truth, that there are these like dropped little crumbs of, we can't really say, we don't really know, but it's possible that, for instance, that she and Fanny Blood really were lovers. Her first friend and lover. And when you hear that all the letters between her and Fuseli are gone, you think, well, what was in those letters? And it's sort of in those cracks and fractures that the novelist can play. And so you have, you're able to sort of stand on the shoulders of giants who've really written her life story. But it's in mining all that rich, deep terrain in the fissures that they can't, nobody knows for sure. And I think that's also where, when we think about our own lives and our own friendships, that's where intimacy happens. Not on the surface, not in the obvious things, not in what's laid bare, but in what's hidden underneath. And so certainly I felt close to her in that way. And as I, again, coming back full circle to having lost my own mother and, having raised 3 kids, there's a part of me that is neither mother nor daughter, but those things are also entirely who I am. I can't be divorced from them either. So it was in finding, those like her experiences as, as daughter, as mother, as lover, as writer, as an ambitious woman, as an angry woman, as a woman with desire, as a woman who railed against injustice. All of those things made me feel close to her.
That's beautiful. I mean, with this book, for me, because you capture every facet of womanhood and every aspect of her character, there's something in it, I think, for everyone. And as a piece of historical fiction, it brings alive Norway and revolutionary France and, London, the sort of late, early 1790s, I guess. And it's this incredible capturing of so many different ways to live life, because that's what she did. She went after life with total gusto. And the book really captures that. I think the way you structured the book, and I think the attention that you brought to her many different relationships really makes her come alive. It's just an incredible achievement. I'm very honored that you asked me to speak with you tonight on your launch week. So
Thank you so
looking at the time, and I'm wondering if there's Jenny.
Here I am. I magically appeared, drop in. Thank you both so much. I am fascinated. I think this was a fantastic conversation. So I thank you both for doing that. For those of you who are joining us, watching this evening, listening this evening, please go ahead and use that chat feature to drop your questions in there. I feel like this was like a wonderful college, lecture of talking about how I was going to ask both of you, but I think you addressed this as why do we still keep coming back to Jane Austen, to Mary Wollstonecraft? Like what is it? I think you did address that a little bit, but is there anything else that question sparks for you? I guess maybe we addressed it with Samantha, but maybe not for you, Natalie, yet.
Oh, I mean, I think that what Jane Austen was most focused on, like Shakespeare, was human character and human nature. And I think that's eternal. And I think she was a genius like Shakespeare. I always say, I think the two of them are duking it out up in heaven for a title of who is best at doing this most efficiently, with like one line of dialogue or one line of verse between those two authors. And I think that in capturing human nature, we can go to Jane Austen, and we may not be able to learn too much about the cold hard facts of the time period in which she lived, because she did not give a lot of detail about that. But ironically, that allows us today to project ourselves into her stories and to learn about ourselves and about our neighbors and our family and our friends, and to do so in a way that is, I find, she gives you a bit of therapy or tonic, because she's not hitting you with a lot of stuff, and you can kind of distract yourself, and you think you're just having a good time, but what you're really doing is seeing the world in this really fun way. So I think she's really helpful for people to understand why we relate to each other the way we do, and why we sometimes hold back from others, and what it takes to live a true and authentic life. Basically, in the end, I think what Jane Austen can tell us today is how to live a happy life. I think her books are very much about how do you find a happy life, especially if you're not being handed much yet on a platter. And it's tempting to marry for the security, etc. But she really, I think, helps you find that strength. And with Mary Wollstonecraft, I think that's probably the thing that you got from her as well, is that she enables us, to find our own inner strength through the example of her resilience.
I think so. And I love actually that Virginia Woolf is the connective tissue.
She is.
Austen and Wollstonecraft, because Wollstonecraft, her husband, widower William Godwin, was almost immediately after she died, rushed a kind of tell-all memoir about her life, and I think he meant well. I mean, I think he wanted people to have the full Wollstonecraft experience, but it scandalized everyone because it left nothing out about her love affairs, her suicide attempts, her struggles with depression. And so really her, even though she was famous in her lifetime and considered an absolutely vital thinker and philosopher of the time, her reputation and legacy really goes underground for 100 years, until Virginia Woolf resurrects her in 1929 and says, we still feel Wollstonecraft, alive and living and breathing and talking in her experiments and living. She's among us now. And I think, I think about Woolf writing about Jane Austen as well. And I love that.
I love that quote she said about how, of all the greats, Jane Austen is the one that you cannot catch in the act of greatness.
It's such
It's brilliant. Yeah. And there was something else that actually, Jenny, I meant to just say to Sam earlier, is that I was reading something Anne Bronte either said or is in one of her books, and I have to find it because I'm trying to quote it in my new manuscript, but it was about how romantic love is the only real truth. And I thought that was really interesting with Love and Fury and what you said about yourself, Sam, and then about how Mary Wollstonecraft lived her life. There is this thing about having ration and sense combined with sensibility and emotional response to your existence that gives the fullness of life. And I think that Jane Austen, is coming at it from one direction, very different from Mary Wollstonecraft. And you're right, Virginia Woolf, I think, is a connector in different ways. And how lucky are we that in the canon, they are so well regarded and so necessary that we can continue to celebrate them and share them with readers.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And when I think about as well, Jane Austen saying, I just drew a circle around a couple of country villages, and in that found all of humanity, that idea. And Wollstonecraft did something different. I mean, she sort of drew, a circle around the whole of, Europe or the whole world if she could have. She desperately wanted to go to America to try to find the same thing. But ends up in the same place, really, finding it at a very human scale. And I relish that. I think, that's sort of the way into Wollstonecraft as a human being.
So something you said, Natalie, makes me ask the two of you as historical fiction writers, in talking about how there wasn't a lot of day-to-day context for when these two writers lived, about how their day-to-day was, and so they wrote on these big topics. But obviously that changes the closer you get to present day, when you're looking at historical pictures of accounts and photographs and actual historical record of how things went from a much broader group of the people living it. So how do you see, what's it going to be like to write historical fiction in 10, 20, 50 years from now about things that are much more present? I mean, you'll have so much more resource, but they'll also, then that's less for you to create, but then also less that you can create, right? In a sense, where do you see that going?
I think really anything that's grounded in motion, that you find enough of the texture and the rest of life that's necessary, but it has to be grounded in what's happening sort of in the interior of the person. And so I would say, again, I can spend an entire afternoon trying to understand what the fabric was like, or what was showing at theaters in London in 1842. But ultimately you keep coming back to the character and what moves the plot forward, and what are the essential elements to understand that are about the story and will help move the story forward.
Okay.
Also, I think, was it Sir Walter Scott that said that historical fiction, or the concept of writing of history in fiction, you need about a 40-year sort of time break. And I have a friend that recently she has a book coming out in July called Shoulder Season, about a playboy.
Oh, Christina Clancy. Yeah,
Yes.
She's local to our area.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
I love Second Home. That was one of my favorite reads last year.
Such a great book. Yeah. And so this book takes place, I think, like 40 years ago. And so that is
in the
a time
80s,
where we don't have cell phones, but we had everything else. And I think that historical fiction, for me, as long as there's enough of a break, that it can operate on two levels. So the level of what we today will benefit from thinking about, and what our present day concerns are, and what we can learn from the people that went before us. And I don't know if that has to be 400 years or 40, but I think as long as you're coming at it, what Sam was saying about the character, but also the sense of what can we learn now from this. And I think that's one reason why World War II remains so popular in historical fiction, is that as the ultimate example of good versus evil, we're still learning things about ourselves, about current day politics, current day leaders, the gamut from the experiences of people at that particular time in history. Sam, you studied history in undergrad, is that right? Yes. Yeah. History is really the study of conflict and like the change that comes out of conflict. And I love, as a screenwriter, you've mentioned conflict a couple of times. I can't write a book unless I know three things: the time period, the setting, and what's at stake.
Yes.
Are they going to save the cottage in the end? Are they going to take over the bookshop? Like whatever. I just need to know that one thing.
Right.
And then I can go. Is that the same for you, Sam? Before you start?
I think that's the dramatic question, and it is the place to start. And I suppose, in some ways with Wollstonecraft, because, and any historical figure, if you know what happens in the end,
Yeah.
you have to create a different dramatic question about their life. And so for me, in some ways, and in working with the structure of this novel, it was, what would the story be that Mary Wollstonecraft wanted to give her daughter, to give to Mary Shelley? And when I was reading Frankenstein, a friend of mine said, "Oh, that's the saddest book that's ever been written." And I thought, well, why do you say that? And she said, well, because it's really about a child who's been abandoned by its creator. And Mary Shelley was obsessed with her mother, whom she never knew, and was, very much like the courtship of Mary and Percy Shelley happened kind of, at Old St. Pancras Churchyard around the grave of Wollstonecraft, where they would read aloud, her mother's work. And so she read her mother's letters and her mother's works, and she was obsessed and informed by the legend kind of Mary Wollstonecraft, without any of the benefit of who she really, was as an intimate human being. Yeah. And so the story is, the dramatic question in a way is, what are the things I leave for my daughter? What are the things I leave for all daughters, for all women, for generations to come? What are those things that I choose about a life? And it's a different kind of dramatic question, but I agree with you. I mean, you have to, you really have to know what that is. Or anyway, I have to know what that is.
Although I have a friend who, I won't say who it is, but a writer who said that she actually writes the last chapter first and then goes back. And I was like, that I couldn't do, because I would have no motivation, because I write to find out, because I pant.
Because you're a pantser, yep.
So I write to find out what's going to happen. It's like, if I knew exactly the last chapter, there's just no way I would write my book. Like, it wouldn't happen. Ginny, I saw some questions at the dinner parties kind of pop up.
Yeah, I was just going to get to that.
Yeah.
So you guys were we were speaking so well about it, so interestingly about historical fiction and the drama. I wanted to let you go, but yes. Okay, so Sam, when you were discussing the dinner parties in the book, this question from Michael, I wondered if you sought to capture the way those characters used language with the vocabulary of the times in which the characters lived, and if so, how did you go about capturing that? Yes, and which is followed up with, could we have participated in the dinner conversations of her times? From Mike.
That's a great question. Again, I think, you have the closest you get to the real voice of a person is in their letters. And even letters, tend to be quite formal in the period. But you do get a sense, and you can read between the lines in the letters as well. And the more intimate letters are when they're writing to a sister they're close to, or a lover, or you start to pick up on almost like tics. Right. Language tics and habits and ways of using imagery, or how they talk about emotion. And so you just sort of, that's the jumble that you're handed. And so to try to create conversation using those tools out of what you need them to discuss at the dinner table in order to move the story forward. That's how I would say. Natalie, maybe you have a thought about that as well.
Oh, I find that for me, the writing I do is so intuitive that I'm almost channeling, I guess, an absorption of language from, I would say, film, especially because I've watched so many old films and studied old films and read so many classics. Like, I still constantly, like, I'm most often reading the words of people from 100 to 200 years ago. And so I find it very easy to be able to project as a writer. I also think that those dinner party scenes that you wrote for me just seemed effortless, as if these characters were driving the scenes for you, which isn't. Sorry, go ahead.
No, and I do agree that what I'm talking about, the research that you do to sort of get them to start talking to you, you have to put that away in the end. You have to turn over all of that. And I find that I know I'm ready to start writing at all when the characters start talking to me. And often it's not at the beginning, they'll just like, I know they're going to say this at some point, in the story. And if you have that line in your head and you write it down, sometimes a scene develops around it. But I also have had the experience of channeling. And after a while, you get so comfortable with their voice in your head that I think they often do tell you what to say.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of fun, and the wit and the repartee and or the hurt or the sarcasm, anything that you get a sense of, like, you get to play with that, and then you scale it back and you sculpt it and you find the scene the most sort of direct way. And believe me, there was a lot of editing of the dinner table scenes, and I thought, really, you're going to take that out? I love that, but usually, I tend to go on and repeat myself. So
there must be some satisfaction, as you said, Samantha, like, because I think I'm this person too. I think of the right thing to say after it is over. Usually, like angry retorts are the things that I think of later, not necessarily like additions to the conversation that way. But this question from Mike, which says, could we have participated in the dinner conversations over times, makes me think it took a very specific type of personality to have this type of dinner conversation, to be a scintillating dinner conversationalist in this time period, right? There was certainly, printed things that were being read, but it wasn't like, the internet where you could read all kinds of things and be caught up on topics of the day before you go to this dinner conversation. So if you're the kind of person that sort of observes everything first, and not the kind of, the extrovert, I guess, who would feel comfortable interjecting, you weren't going to be seen as a very good dinner conversationalist, were you? And yet there were probably, all kinds of thoughts going on in their head.
I think that's true. But I think, big personalities are big personalities at any time in history. And so I think all of those people around that dinner table who got invited back night after night, and Wollstonecraft had a standing invitation every single night to be at that dinner table, no matter who else was there. It was like, you've earned your place at this dinner table, and it will be here for you. And Johnson, I just think Joseph Johnson might not have been a huge personality, but he was an impresario. He brought these people together, and they revered him, and he gave a lot of them voice through publication. So I think that, again, if you're a big personality, you could have participated in those dinner conversations.
Sure. Well, I think about and then I want to ask about this a little bit too, but the TV show Dickinson, which is all about Emily Dickinson, which I think is a really interesting modern sort of take on the historical figure. It's just very interesting in general, but that we see her as a very reclusive, shy, introverted person. And I wonder, what she would have done at one of these dinner conversations. I don't know that she would have been one of the people that was contributing, but I think then she would have gone home and written about it, right?
Yeah,
which is interesting to think of. But so I do want to ask before we go, because you have I know Natalie worked in the entertainment law, or you said you had friends in the entertainment law side, and of course Samantha on the screenwriting side. How does that impact your writing process, and what does that mean when you publish a book? Are there automatically questions about what you're going to do with it down the road as well?
Yes, I mean, my debut novel, Mr. Dickens and His Carol, started as a screenplay, which I optioned 4 times to 4 different companies, and over 15 years had really near misses with the big screen. And so it was a big surprise to me that it ended up having life, and such a wonderful life as a novel. And now I'm adapting it for the stage, for Seattle Repertory Theater.
Yes, I saw that.
The soup of the soup of the soup. But I am affected very much. Screenwriting really informs the way I approach novel writing, and I feel it served me well to sort of understand plot so well and be able to just keep asking questions about, does this scene move it forward? What's the beginning, middle, and end? I don't obey always a 3-act structure, but I believe that it's our nature that, even our dreams have a 3-act structure. So these, kinds of things are always there in the background for me, and I use them very much in the novel writing.
It's funny because I think Sid Field's screenplay, book on screenplay, was for me pretty transformative in terms of my understanding that I've got to get the attention of the reader at a certain point. And when I write, I almost think about what would I want to have happening now? Because I don't outline. So it's like, what would I as a viewer, as if I was watching this as a mini series, or as a reader, what is it I most would want to see next? And, balancing that. And in the editing, phase, you fix that a bit. But for me, I write very filmically. So I have an omniscient narrative voice that does free and direct discourse, similar to Austen, and goes into different characters' heads. And if you were to actually, I didn't figure this out until after I wrote the book, that every beginning chapter has to introduce 8 different characters in my book. And the beginning of each chapter, you're looking down on somebody as if you're looking down through a camera. And the next question for me as the writer always is, who else is there? Who else could be looking at them? And then that's how another character often gets introduced. So I definitely have this very filmic approach. My agent, we've been optioned for film and TV for this book. It hasn't been announced formally yet. And my agent was like, 8 characters, Natalie, is a lot. So when you do your next book, you might, So for my next book, which comes out next May, I gave him 9 because that's the kind of gal I am.
Amazing.
Like, I'll take that. So now he's like, there's 9.
Which I feel like Jane and Mary and Virginia, for that matter, would all appreciate that response, Natalie. So. We are right at the end here. Oh, there's one more question that came in. How did Wollstonecraft get along financially?
Well, she, had a lot of bad jobs she didn't like as governess and companion to an old wealthy woman, governess in Ireland. And she hated them because she gave up her independence. And so eventually she sort of arrives at the door of Joseph Johnson, who'd already published one of her books, and said, I want to make a living as a writer and you have to help me. You're the only one I know who can help me. And he did. And that's what she did. That's how she made her living for the rest of her life, which was remarkable at the time.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I would like to thank the two of you so much. This has been an amazing conversation, truly. Virtual events, we were speaking earlier before we officially started, and how one of the great benefits of virtual is that we can put people sort of in a Zoom room who may not have been able to be together in person, at least on tour for the book. So I'm so grateful for the two of you for your time and your expertise. This has been really fascinating.
Natalie and Jenny Anderson's Bookshop. Really appreciate the chance to talk about the book.
Absolutely. I did drop links in the chat. If you would like a signed copy of Love and Fury, you can get that from Anderson's. If you would like a hardcover of Natalie's book from last year, or the paperback that's coming out this summer, you can get that from Anderson's Bookshop as well. We'd be happy to send those out to you. And thank you so much, everyone, for your time, and congratulations to happy 1-year book anniversary, Natalie, for yours. I can't wait to see what the next book with all 9 characters is, and your option news as well. And Samantha, congratulations on the release this week. Thank you for letting us be your first event, and I can't wait to see the next things that come from you as well.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Everybody be safe. Stay happy reading out there. Okay. Take care. Bye.